This is the Olympus M.Zuiko 17mm F1.8 with the model number EW-M1718, and the model number, the 17 in the model number stands for the focal length and the 18 stands for the aperture. This lens was announced in June 2012 and it weighs 120 grams and the length of the lens is 3.55 centimeters, so that's the portion which protrudes from the camera once you insert it into the camera. And here I have the lens hood on as well, which is adding a little bit to the length of the lens. It has a filter thread of 46 millimeters, so you can see the number 46 there, if you can see that. The widest aperture is f1.8 and the smallest aperture that you can set it to is f22. It has 7 aperture blades, so that gives you an idea of how the bokeh will look like, or the background blur. It doesn't have a lens hood thread, so you can get a metal lens hood which you screw on, and this lens hood is called the LH-48B. So it's made out of metal, so it's slightly heavier than the typical plastic lens hoods. And one of the disadvantages of these type of lens hoods is that you need 3 hands to actually attach it. So you need 1 hand to hold the lens hood, 1 to turn the screw here, and also 1 to hold the camera or the lens. So I find these type of lens hoods to be difficult to attach, but the advantages of these type of lenses that don't have a filter thread and are made out of metal is that they're easier and more practical for attaching a matte box to them. So depending on how you use this lens, you might prefer or dislike this attribute of this lens. The lens has a focus ring, so as you can see here, and it also has a manual focus clutch, which means the focus ring can be pulled back, and there you can see the distance. So essentially what happens when you pull the focus clutch back and twist it, you're turning the lens into a fully manual focus lens. The closest focusing distance for this lens is 25 centimeters and the diagonal angle of view is 65 degrees. So the disadvantages of this lens, in my opinion, is that it has a metal lens hood, or the fact that it doesn't have a lens hood thread, so you need to attach the metal lens hood. And there's a few disadvantages with the metal lens hoods. One is that they're heavier, so they typically make the small lenses a little bit front heavy. And the other thing is if you bump it into something, they actually damage the lens as opposed to the lens hood breaking or taking the impact, because they're really solid and also they're difficult to attach. So one of the advantages of this lens hood in comparison to the lens hood for the 12mm f2 is that it's round, so whichever direction you attach it, it doesn't make a difference. Whereas if you look on this lens hood, which is a square lens hood, you need to always get the angle right so that it essentially aligns with the sensor of the camera. Whereas this is not an issue for the 17mm one. And just so that you know the names for these two lens hoods, this is the LH-48 for the 12mm f2 lens, and this is the LH-48B for the 17mm f1.8. Another disadvantage of this lens is that it has some distortion, but aside from the distortion, it probably has the worst chromatic aberration I've ever seen on a lens. So the chromatic aberration on this lens is really bad. So I would say make sure that you have a lens hood or a matte box on this so that light isn't hitting the lens from directions that you don't want it to hit, and ideally probably it's best with this lens not to shoot directly into light. So if you have a backlit situation, this lens won't cope nicely with that. And the other disadvantage of this lens is that it's not weatherproof. So typically with Olympus lenses, the M.Zuiko Pro series are weatherproof, whereas these ones, which are part of the normal M.Zuiko series as opposed to the Pro series, these don't have weather sealing. So if I show you here, then you can see it doesn't have anything to stop water or dust getting in. The advantages of this lens is that it's really small, so you can see that even with the lens hood attached, it's quite small, and it's very light as well. It only weighs 120 grams, and it has a f1.8 aperture, so you can get a shallow depth of field with this lens, and you can also let in a lot of light. And one of the things that I mentioned as a disadvantage could also be an advantage, which is that It doesn't have a lens hood thread, but it's made out of metal, so it's easy for attaching a matte box. So this is one of those things which is either advantage or disadvantage depending on how you plan to use this lens. I think the only comparison I can make for this lens is the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 17mm F1.8. So if you compare this lens to that lens, this one weighs 120 grams, whereas that lens weighs 390 grams. So the Pro series lens is obviously a lot heavier. And then the length of this lens is 3.5 centimeters, whereas the Pro lens is 8.7 centimeters. So again, more than twice as long. And the aperture on this is f1.8, whereas the aperture on that one is f1.2. So in the aperture department, the Pro series lens is better, but the maximum setting that you can have for the aperture on this lens is f22, whereas on the Pro lens it's f16. So typically I don't think people usually shoot above f16 anyway, but it's just something to be aware of. So this lens does have some advantages over the Pro series lens in that its aperture can go up all the way to f22 and is smaller and lighter. So the 17mm f1.2, which is from the M.Zuiko Pro series, that has 9 aperture blades, which means in theory you should have better background blur and bokeh. And that one is also weather sealed, and it also has a lens function button, and that one also has the manual focus clutch, which this one has as well. So generally speaking, obviously the M.Zuiko Pro series lens will be better, but in terms of size and weight and smallest aperture at f22, this one is actually better than the Pro series lens. So the other lenses that you can compare this to would be the zoom lenses in the M.Zuiko Pro series. So all of those would obviously outperform this one, but typically they would have a smaller aperture. So with the zoom lenses, they typically don't go to f1.8, which this one has. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens, or if you want me to provide more information or compare it to any other lens.